Thank you for joining. My name's Sean Massey, and I'm a staff multi-cloud solutions architect with VMware's multi-cloud architecture and strategy team. Today we're going to talk about using Amazon's FSX for Windows File Server service with VMware Horizon. Now, before we begin, let's talk briefly about what Amazon's FSX for Windows File Server service is. It is a fully managed, highly reliable, and scalable file storage as a service offering hosted in AWS. It provides a secure and compliant file server options that is, again, a fully managed service built on Windows Server. It provides traditional SMB network shares for solutions like virtual desktops, as well as any other enterprise application that needs an SMB share. Now, because this is built on Windows Server, it can easily integrate into existing enterprise environments, and it's managed using Windows File Server tools, but also you get the ability to utilize AWS services like CloudWatch for monitoring because this is hosted in AWS. If you need to replicate data from on-premises to this hosted file service, you can also utilize a service like AWS Data Sync. To learn more about FSX for Windows File Server, you can find the link to the product page at the bottom. So let's talk about how we will utilize FSX with Horizon when we deploy Horizon in VMware Cloud on AWS. Now, the first thing is, in order to utilize VMware Cloud on AWS, we have to deploy an SDDC. We also need to establish some sort of connectivity between the on-premises environment in AWS if you plan to extend an existing on-premises environment to the cloud, or if you plan to migrate data as part of a cloud migration. Now, once we have our SDDC and our VPC deployed and we have our connectivity established, we would need to deploy a Microsoft Active Directory service in AWS. Now, this could either be a standalone Active Directory environment, utilizing a service such as Amazon Managed Active Directory Service, or you can extend an existing Enterprise Active Directory environment by deploying domain controllers for that domain in the cloud. If you do utilize a standalone Active Directory service, but you still need to connect to on-premises resources, you would have to use a Forest Trust to connect to the existing domain. Now, once we have Active Directory deployed, then we can start deploying Amazon's FSX for Windows File Server service. FSX for Windows File Server does require some sort of Active Directory environment as part of that deployment, so this is a prerequisite that we have to have in place. Now, once that service is deployed, we can start to integrate that with the rest of the enterprise environment. This is when we can create and secure our file shares. If we're using DFS namespaces, we can add those shares to our namespace. If we're utilizing VMware Horizon, we could configure Dynamic Environment Manager to utilize these new file shares to store configuration and user data. And if we have to synchronize data from on-prem, we can then utilize AWS's Data Sync to do one- or two-way synchronization. Now, as part of that deployment, there are a few things we would need to do. Now, first, we need to configure our networks to allow traffic between our VPC and our VMware Cloud on AWS SDDC. Now, when we deploy resources in the cloud by default, there is typically a security group around it that limits which resources or which IP ranges can access it. Now, this is the case for both connecting to the FSX service from our SDDC, as well as allowing FSX traffic to flow back into the SDDC. So we need to establish a security group for our FSX resources that we're going to deploy. That includes the ports and the IP ranges that are allowed to talk to them. We'll also need to add that security group to the security group that is on the ENI that connects our VPC to the SDDC. Now, On our SDDC side, we do need to configure the NSX compute gateway to allow traffic over the VPC interface, and we need to allow that to go both directions. And finally, we do need to enable FSX to talk to any other resources that may be deployed in the VPC. So if we have an Active Directory environment or EC2 instances that also need to access the file shares on this service, they will need to be configured to allow access to that as well. Now, after we have our network communications established, we will need to configure DNS to resolve any FSX endpoints that are created. In order to configure our file shares, we will need some sort of management jump box with the file server management tools installed, so we can remote into that server and create our shares and configure the NTFS security on those shares as well. Now, this is our reference architecture for what we're going to be deploying. The key things I want to call out is that the connectivity between our SDDC and our VPC is going over this cross VPC ENI. All right, so now let's switch over to our demo. So the first thing we're going to show is configuring the security group for our FSX for Windows File Server service. Now, we have a security group that we've already created that we're going to use in our deployment, and I'm going to bring that group up here. What you can see is that we have configured this group to allow traffic from our SDDC IP range using the ports that are required for the FSX for Windows file service, and these ports are found in the Amazon documentation. Now, it's not just enough to create this security group that will attach to the FSX for Windows file service. We also need to attach this security group to the default security group. The default security group is the security group that is used by the ENIs that connect the VPC to the SDDC. And so for any traffic that we want to flow between our two environments, we need to have in this group. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and walk through the deployment of FSX for Windows. So to do that, we just go into that portion of the AWS console, click Create File System, and then select FSX for Windows File Server. Now, there's a couple of things we need to determine here when we deploy this. We have to give it a name. And then we have to determine if this is going to be a multi-AZ or a single AZ. So for the purposes of the demo, we're going to select single AZ, and we're just going to give this about 100 gigabytes of storage. After that, we just need to select our VPC, our security group, and we'll remove the default one there, and then select the subnet that we're going to place this in. Our next option that we have to choose is how we're going to handle Windows authentication to the service, and this is where we choose between an existing AWS managed Active Directory environment or an Active Directory environment that you would provide. So I'm going to choose an Active Directory environment that we would provide and just fill in a couple of details here. Now, with this, we will have to provide a service account that is going to be used for joining this to the domain. And then last, we can choose an OU to put the service in after it joins the domain. We're just going to leave that as the default for this. And then we have to put in a group that is going to have delegated administration. Now, by default, this is the domain admins group. But if you have a different group for file servers or whatnot, we'll just go ahead and put that in here. We get one more chance to review our settings for the service, and then we go ahead and click Create File System. Now, this can take a while to deploy, So we already have one created to kind of show the next step of this process. So before we go over to our jump box to configure our shares using the Windows File Server Management tools, first we just need to grab some information out of FSX. The main thing we need to get is our DNS name or our IP address, because we're going to use this data in the management tools to create our shares. And then we're also going to use this when we configure our file shares or group policy to point to this location. So we're going to copy this name here, and then we're going to head over to our jump box. Now, in order to manage these file shares, we're actually going to utilize the Microsoft Management Console. This is built into every instance of Windows Server. And we are just going to add the shared folders snap-in. Now for this, we just paste our DNS name for our service. Go ahead and click finish. And here we can expand this. We can see our shares. So these are all the shares that are available on that machine. We can do things like open up the D drive remotely. We can create our folders that we need. So we'll just call this like data. And, this is like managing a traditional Windows file server. You would configure your NTFS permissions on this folder, and then you would create the share using this console here. So we create a new share. We would point to the folder that we would be using, and then we would configure the permissions. Right? So we have 2 shares configured on this server. Now the next thing that we would do is we would configure a service like Dynamic Environment Manager to utilize these shares, and we can see that here with our FSX file server, we have it pointing to our shared folder and mapping as the Y drive. So let's show this in action. We're going to load up our Horizon client, and we're going to connect to our lab environment and launch our test pool. And now what we should see when we sign into this desktop is a network share that is mounted for that AWS file server location, and we should be able to browse that as well. Okay, and so now we're signed into our desktop, and if I go and launch Windows Explorer, you can now see that we have our file server on the Amazon FSX shared folder, and I can do things like creating a new folder, creating documents, or copying data over to it. And if you want to learn more about VMware's digital workspaces solutions, including our reference architectures and deployment guides for Horizon on VMware Cloud on AWS, check out techzone.vmware.com. This is where we publish all of our latest end-user computing information and our thought leadership and other resources. And with that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us today to learn about how to use Amazon's FSX for Windows File Server service with VMware Horizon on VMware Cloud on AWS. Thank you and have a great day.